See how history, by definition, is all around us. I would have walked by this building for most of my life and never known what was here before. So when I was walking down towards the Botanic Gardens here a couple of weeks ago with my girlfriend, I heard two old men say that they used to hear screams of boys basically emanating from behind the high walls that was once here. The place was called Marlborough House, and it was an industrial school from 1944 up until 1972, and by all accounts the place was one of the worst in Ireland, which, if you think about places like Letterfrack, Golden Bridge and Artane, then that's really saying something. Through a little bit of research, I found out that writer, actor and Dublin City Council politician Mannix Flynn had been an inmate there. I contacted him, and fair play to him, he got straight back to me with a whole lot of information and also told me to read the Ryan report. So I took Mannix up on his recommendation and started reading through the Ryan report. I've got chapter 16 here. It's based on the Marlborough House. Well, let me just say, it's not easy reading, especially if you're an empathetic person. Responsibility for the running of Marlborough House was divided between two government departments, and this lack of clarity was part of the problem. The Department of Justice was responsible for the legal side. It certified Marlborough House as a place of detention and dealt with the court sentencing and sending boys there. The Department of Education was responsible for the day-to-day running of the institution. It paid the staff and was meant to oversee how the centre operated. In reality, each department often pointed to the other when problems arose. This confusion meant that no single authority took full responsibility, and proper oversight was weak. This meant that Marlborough House became a place where poor conditions were allowed to develop and continue because no one really took responsibility. The Department of Education was in charge, but it failed to provide proper care, education or trained staff. Many staff were actually recruited from the local unemployment office with little or no training in working with children. At the same time, the Department of Justice had only limited oversight role and didn't step in where the problems were clear. As a result, the boys lived in overcrowded, filthy, dirty conditions with little education, and there were reports of physical and sexual abuse. Complaints were made for years, but little changed. And in the end, it was a lack of clear accountability and weak inspection that allowed the situation to continue for decades. And it's exemplified in the case of this letter that's written by one of the people who worked in there to the Minister for Education in 2017, and it goes as follows. Dear Minister, I have the distinction of being the only person who worked within the child detention system to have publicly exposed the Dickensian conditions in which children were held in custody on behalf of the state, and for that I have paid a heavy penalty. In 1971, I worked as an attendant in Marlborough House, a remand home for boys between the age of 7 and 17. At Christmas of 1971, the staff of the house had cleared the place of all detainees in order that they might hold a Christmas party in the home. They achieved this every Christmas with the cooperation of the Gardaí. I made an excuse not to attend the party. They, my co-workers, were not the sort of party goers with whom I would wish to celebrate Christmas. On St. Stephen's Day of that year, a Garda called to my flat in Ballymun with a request that I come down to Marlborough House and meet with the matron of the house. When I called on that elderly lady, I was met with a woman who was in a near panic. She told me that Gardaí in Limerick had sent a boy of 12 or 13 to the house, thus disrupting the revelry. She said that members of staff had taken the boy from his bed in the early hours of the morning, tied him to a pot-bellied stove, not to burn him, just simply to make him sweat, and brought him outside to the rough ground and had given him the clatters at the back of the garden. She knew that they were threatening to repeat their performance that very night and worried that they would do the boy some serious damage. That night I reported for duty and found only the matron and the boy in residence. Later that night the head attendant arrived, blindingly drunk, and after threatening the lad, returned to his upstairs flat. Later that night I left the house and walked a short distance up the street. The matron released the boy from the front door, and I met him, and I took him down to my flat in Ballymun, where my wife Patricia and my sister Margaret took him in charge. Next morning I told the lad that Patricia and Maureen would bring him to Houston station and put him on the Limerick train, and he should tell the Gardaí what had happened to him. The young lad did just that. Though not in Limerick, he left the train at an earlier station and went to the Garda station in that town. The morning after the so-called escape, two officials from the Department of Education arrived at Marlborough House to interview the staff. When my turn came to be questioned, I preempted their queries by at once admitting my part in the matter. The interview ended there. Word came later that day that the boy was once again in police custody. The other attendants who had gathered for a council of war were positively salivating at the prisoner being returned to Marlborough House, and the threats that filled the air were blood-curdling. Not surprisingly, because the boy had escaped, but because in doing so, he had taken the chief superintendent's keys. When I had met the lad the previous night, he had at once handed me these keys, explaining that he had gone up to the drunken man's room and taken the keys from his bedside table in order that he might create the impression that he had escaped through his own efforts and thus avoided having the blame attached to me or the matron. The courage and the honour of a young boy who had never had much of a chance in life. I felt so humbled. There was some state apologies and redress for the survivors, but there's not even a plaque at the site, which I think is basically the state trying to forget that the place even existed. And yet, places like this are dotted up and down the country, and we shouldn't forget.